Hello and welcome to our film screening and talk series. My name is Sataan Al-Hassan, and I am the coordinator for research programming and publications at the Africa Institute in Sharjah, UAE. Thank you all for joining us today to discuss the film titled I'm Not Your Negro, directed by Raoul Peck with Professor Dagmawi Woubshet, Ahuja Family Presidential Associate Professor of English at the University of Pennsylvania. In case you haven't seen the film, please note that it is still available on our website for free live streaming until midnight tonight. Our website address is theafricainstitute.org for those of you who do not know it. I'd like to introduce Professor Dagmawi. He is the author of The Calendar of Loss, Race, Sexuality, and Mourning in the Early Era of AIDS, which was published by Johns Hopkins University Press in 2015. He co-edited the volume titled Ethiopia, Literature, Art, and Culture, which is a special issue of Kalalu. His writings appeared in various publications such as Transition, Inka, Journal of Contemporary and African Art, The Atlantic, among many others. He is currently working on his second book, Here Be Saints, James Baldwin's Late Style, which is precisely the reason he's been invited for this program. Before we start, I would like to mention how important and broad the themes discussed in this film are. In the time we have today, we hope to give each theme its weight. We will discuss James Baldwin, the director, Raoul Peck, and the film, and then open it up for questions from the audience. For questions, please make sure to use the Q&A feature because it makes it easier for us to keep up with incoming questions. Thank you, Dagmawi, for agreeing to take part in this conversation. It is lovely to have a dialogue with you about this film. I'd like to start off, if you could just please tell us a bit about James Baldwin, who he was, and a background about his work.
All right. Well, Sataan, thank you so much for this invitation. And what a treat to have this conversation with you. And also thanks to the Africa Institute for holding this conversation, and also for making the film available to anyone interested in watching it. Let me just say that, any occasion to discuss James Baldwin's work is both a privilege and a joy. Because it's a way of communing with a writer of immense creative power and moral imagination, and a writer who is just as important today as he was in his own lifetime. Now, you mentioned this, it's a challenging undertaking also, because I'm reminded of what Toni Morrison says in her eulogy. Morrison was close friends with Baldwin. She says in her eulogy, she says, Jimmy, there is too much to think about you and too much to feel. The difficulty is your life refuses summation. It always did. It invites contemplation instead, right? Now, Baldwin's life refuses summation, firstly because he was a writer with an arsenal of creative talent. He was a novelist, he was an essayist, he was a playwright, he was a poet, and over the span of a half a century, produced a vast and incomparable body of work. He wrote 6 novels, 6 different books of essays, 3 plays, a book of poems, a children's book, and several other collaborations, including with visual artists, not to mention works that have been published since his passing in 1987. So just the sheer volume of his corpus makes it difficult to kind of just quickly or easily encapsulate his work, say in a word or in a sentence, or even for that matter, in a single book. Also, I should add, what makes Baldwin's life's difficult to sum up is that the time frame in which he wrote. So some of his earliest pieces, his essays, appear in the late 1940s, and his last published essay appears in 1987. So 40 years of incredibly active writing life. And in that time, when you think about it, from the 40s to the 1980s is a time in which the world saw cataclysmic, revolutionary change, right? So for instance, Baldwin started his writing career right after the end of World War II, something that he witnessed. He saw the end of American apartheid, the end of European colonial rule. He saw firsthand the beginning and end of the civil rights movement, the Vietnam War, the Reagan Revolution, and so forth, right? So, and Baldwin is there at each kind of pivotal moment, reflecting on the significance of these world historical changes. So although there's a kind of constant thread in his work from his early writings in the 40s to the 80s, we see notable changes in his style and artistic temperament. So the expansive and volatile time in which he lived and wrote makes it difficult to kind of reduce him, for instance, just to the period of the civil rights movement, with which his work is often, and narrowly, I might add, associated. Let me also say this, that Baldwin, was born in 1924 and was a child prodigy, a teenage prodigy. Before he became a writer, he'd already assumed the public stage. He was a known adolescent preacher, was a minister of the faith from age 14 to age 17. So which is to say that at such an early age, he had kind of mastered the word, right? And moreover, had such an intimate and such an acute knowledge of the rites and rituals of the Black church, including its vast repertoire of gospel songs. And his own affinity to music would show up again and again in his essays and also in his fiction. Right? Now, as a writer, of course, we know Baldwin for his signature style, which is his prose, right? Which stands out for its complexity, its intricate design, depth of perception, and so fierce in its determination to dismantle the racial assumptions of the American Republic and the English language, right, as a writer. And also equally fearless in explicitly broaching themes like queer sexuality. So from the very outset, if you will, of his career, Baldwin wrote about identity not in kind of discrete, cordoned off categories, but as overlapping, right? Constantly thinking about how race, queer sexuality, nationality, religion, class coalesced, came together, to shape his own identity, and in general, how these categories mutually reinforce each other in shaping who we all are, right? So again, to Morrison's words, it's hard to sum him up precisely because his work deals with not just race or a kind of singular uniform African-American identity, but for example, how race impinges on our idea and ideals of sexuality, how these categories are inextricably linked. Now, let me add just one point before I may. And that is now, it's true that, Baldwin's work certainly offers us one of the most eloquent and trenchant critiques of white supremacy, right? That, how white power is contingent, dependent on Black subjugation, and how that cruel imbalance, if you will, totally warps the people, the institutions, the moral character of America and the modern world, right? If you ask me what one of the most notable contributions in terms of how we understand this idea of race, one of the notable contributions of Baldwin in theorizing race is that he's introduced this idea, the feeling of innocence, to be part and parcel of white power and white identity, right? And in a memorable line in The Fire Next Time from 1963, he says, "It is not permissible that the authors of devastation should also be innocent. It is the innocence which constitutes the crime," right? Which is to say that, it's one thing to enslave a group of people for centuries, to lynch them, to disenfranchise them, right? Yet it's another to totally disavow and willfully ignore and erase that history, right? And cling to this false ideal of America as, the exception, or America as the great, grand, noble purveyor of democracy, right? So Baldwin constantly tried to question this notion of American innocence with which, we continue to live, and which exacts its toll at this hour on the world stage today. And also another constant in Baldwin's work is to counter this feeling, this notion of innocence, is how his fidelity to the idea of love, right? By showing us the full resources, the ethics, the prerogatives of love, in particular Black love, right? Which he considered to be the most sacred and the most inviolable human act that we have. And in his fiction, in many ways, his fiction is a meditation on love, how we sabotage it, how we betray it, how we yearn for it, and how we dare to enact it. Maybe these words can provide a kind of entry point into the conversation.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for that. A very comprehensive, extensive explanation and background on James Baldwin and his work. It's funny that for someone that had such an acute understanding of film and film in America, he never had the chance to make a film. But he did contribute to film in a beautiful way with his critique in his book, The Devil Finds Work, which was published in 1976. And it offers a great analysis of American cinema, the racism that exists within the country and the industry, and it helped him understand white America. I always feel like he had the aspiration to make a film, but for some reason never really had the chance to. Maybe that's very closely related to this racism that he was speaking about in his book. But in terms of today's topic, which is I'm Not Your Negro, which is based on a manuscript that he wrote late in his life, titled Remember This House. Little did he know that he was writing one of the best documentaries, or a part of the best documentary, in history. Could you tell us more about his experience as a Black writer in America and what resulted in him, or could have resulted in him, beginning this manuscript?
Yes, absolutely. And I'm so glad that you brought up the Devil Finds Work, from one of his late works that doesn't, or that has not courted full, critical and scholarly attention. And I would, certainly suggest folks to pick up that book from which we can easily glean how much of a film buff that he was, and also how much of an astute critic of film that he was, right? And in that book, we get Baldwin begins it, in fact, by giving us a kind of inventory of the films that made such a strong impression of him as a kid, and what that, in hindsight, what that experience was like of being, a young kid, and as he says, going with his mother or his aunt or his mentor to see a film. And in this book, there are many films that he discusses, including, Dance Fools Dance, 2,000 Years at Sing Sing, Guess Who's Coming to Dinner, films which, some of the analysis is actually excerpted in Raoul Peck's I'm Not Your Negro. Mm. And what I love about this book is also, he also gives us his take on literary works that have been adapted to film, including Dickens's A Tale of Two Cities, Richard Wright's Native Son, and his friend Lorraine Hansberry, her play A Raisin in the Sun. And you get just, again, how sharp he is about adaptation, how just how things change depending on genre, how the story changes depending on genre. And moreover, he tells us that, one of the things that he captures in this text is the kind of, certainly when he was growing up, the dissonance between what he saw on the screen, right, and the reality or the fiction that's portrayed on the screen, and the reality as he knew it and as people lived it, right? And how, in particular, certainly in American cinema, how race mediates the very construction of American film, right? And one of my favorite lines, this is not from The Devil Finds Work, but from another late work, his last novel, Just Above My Head. This is a character, Julia, African-American character, and she goes to Africa. She's in Cote d'Ivoire, and she makes such a compelling observation. She says, and I'm quoting her, she says, how, again, this medium, cinema, mediated African-American and African relationships. She says, Hollywood threw acid in both your eyes before you were 7 years old. You're blind. That's the first thing you realize, is that you're blind. Later, you begin to see something, and then you begin to see what you can see, right? Meaning that the power of this industry, right, to mediate African and African-American relationship, but also our own self-conception as Black people, and certainly his own self-conception as a Black person, right? And obviously how much Hollywood trafficked in racist imagery. Now, you're right, he never got a chance to make his own film, but over the course of his life, he became the subject of several films, right? Now, sure, Raoul Peck's recent film may be the most celebrated. Yeah. But before that, we have Horace Ove's Baldwin's Nigger from 1968, Terrence Dixon's Meeting the Man James Baldwin in Paris. This is from 1971. Sedat Paket's James Baldwin from Another Place, which is shot in Turkey from 1973, a gem lyrical film, short film. Dick Fontaine's I Heard It Through the Grapevine, which is from 1980. Another one, a famous one, Karen Thornstein's James Baldwin, The Price of the Ticket from 1989, right? So that's a number of films in which he is the subject of kind of cinema verite. And I should add, two of his novels now have been adapted into film. His first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, sometime in the mid 80s, and also, as we, recently, Barry Jenkins's adaptation of If Beale Street Could Talk. And I think had he lived long enough, he died only, 64 years old. I'd imagine Filmmaker probably would have been in his credit.
Yeah, that probably would have been the time. So speaking of James Baldwin and his writings, he never really lived in the U.S. He didn't live in the U.S. his entire life. He moved around a lot. We know that he lived in places such as France, Turkey, Morocco, and Switzerland. But his most significant time was the time in France. He wrote a lot of his books, met a lot of authors, and learned about other forms of racism that existed outside of the US. But he still had a very good understanding of racism in the US and daily life in the US. And he shared a similar experience as the people that are discussed in the film, Medgar Evers, Malcolm X, and Martin Luther King. His first move away from the US was in 1948.
That's right.
And then he had another move in 1970. What is his prime fear? The reason for leaving the US at the beginning was, correct me if I'm wrong, but it was he feared what it would do to him to stay in the US longer. Could you tell us a bit about why he left multiple times and why he returned to the US?
Yes, absolutely. So, as you rightly put it, so he left in 1948 on a fellowship that actually Richard Wright, who was then his mentor, secured for him, and he goes to Paris. And he writes about this in several essays, and he says there was no way for him to be a writer and remain in the United States because of the just extraordinary racism of American life in 1948, right? So the kind of racism that he encountered, James Baldwin, the person of James Baldwin encountered, right? And he talks about the rage that he was seized by a certain kind of rage that inevitably would be would lead to his ruin, and he had to find some space in order for him to become the writer that he knew he could become. Right, so he leaves New York in 1948 and goes to Paris for close to a decade, for about 1957, right? And he returns frequently to the US, but really from 48 on, much of his life is actually spent abroad. So, for instance, the scholar Magdalena Zabrowska has written about Baldwin's Turkish decade. So, for instance, from 1961 to 1971, that decade, in and out, he was in Turkey for long stretches, right? So a decade in Turkey, a decade in Paris, and as you rightly put it, in 1970, he bought a house and moved to Saint-Paul-de-Vence in the south of France. So until his death in 1987, for those 17 years, he lived in the south of France. That said, he came to the United States periodically, and certainly during the civil rights movement. Right, both as he says, as a witness to chronicle the movement, and lend his talent and increasingly his fame, right, his public stature to the cause. So he would, appear on all these talk shows. Again, we see footage of that in I'm Not Your Negro. And also because, his mother was in New York, his sister, his brother, right? So he was always tethered to the United States because of familial ties. And also in the 1980s, he came for a stretch in the United States and taught at in and out at a number of, for semesters at a number of US colleges. But that perspective of living in not just in Europe, in Paris or south of France, but also in Turkey, right? Gave him such an incredible outlook on, from a distance, as he used to say, about the American experience, right? And more generally, how that experience maps onto the world and the kinship to be had between, say, African Americans and Africans, or African Americans and people from the Maghreb, Algerians, for instance, Moroccans in Paris, so on and so forth. Not only that, his own kind of transatlantic experience and experience as an expatriate gave him fodder for his writing. So if you think of some of his iconic early essays, Stranger in the Village, Encounters on the Seine, these are staged in plot, narrate his own story of what it meant to be, for instance, in Stranger in the Village. He says the first Black person to happen on that Swiss Hamlet, right? Or in his fiction, Giovanni's Room, which is from 1955, that's his second novel. All of it is set in France. Another Country is set in the US, but also we have stretches of it kind of in France. Just Above My Head is in London. It's in France. It's in the US. His the very last work that he completed, it's not published, but it's the play, The Welcome Table, is all set in the south of France. So I think that experience gave him, if you will, kind of dilated, expanded his own vision on the American experience, but experience of the world at large, and also opened up a different kind of terrain for his creative work. And, he used to call himself a transatlantic commuter, which I think nicely captures the constant shuttling back and forth across the Atlantic.
No, it must be fear could be a very paralyzing experience. And it's hard to really focus. Raoul Peck, in one of the interviews that he had, he explains how it was very difficult reading through all the writings for Baldwin, the videos, the interviews, speaking to his family. He was very afraid, and experiencing that sort of fear could be very paralyzing. And also you get a lot of perspective, standing away and coming out, looking into the American experience. So it helped him write a lot, as you said.
Yeah, absolutely. And Sataan, if I may just quickly add, if you think about it, in 1948, when he left, and really in the 50s, even as a writer, you assumed second-class citizenship. There was the category of the Negro writer. So if you look at the kind of debates in even the most progressive literary magazines, for instance, there's a famous debate between Irving Howe, who was the editor of Dissent magazine, a very progressive kind of Marxist-leaning magazine, and Ralph Ellison, who was considered one of the leading literary writers, literary artists, African-American writers. Usually was considered, in the 50s, you had Richard Wright, Ralph Ellison, and James Baldwin. But even in this exchange between Ralph Ellison and Irving Howe, you see how oppressive the very category of the Negro writer was. To qualify the writer as a Negro writer was, on the one hand, to kind of pigeonhole you, which is to say that white critics, even progressive ones, prescribe what you ought to and write about, what your subject matter should be about as a Black writer, meaning that it should exclusively focus on race, and you cannot somehow tackle on other things, right, about life. So that in itself, I think that category for an artist itself just hems you in, boxes you in. And I think it was also the desire in order for him to realize his full potential as a writer was also to break that category of what it meant to be a Negro writer. Now, this isn't to romanticize France, of course, and he doesn't romanticize it because, you know, French racism in 1948 was also alive and well. But as an American, as an African-American, at least it was a different racial economy, and he was able to carve out a different kind of freedom to execute his writing.
Thank you. But one of the books that he started, which is Remember This House. And he started writing in France, but never had the chance to continue, which is the basis of this film. I'd like to ask you about what you think of the title of the manuscript. And I ask because there's an interview with David Leeming, who's his biographer at the time and who worked with him very closely. And he explains that if you looked at the transcript, the manuscript, you would notice that the title was originally written with the word remember as two words. R-E with a backslash and then member. Does this sort of, ring any bell?
Well, Sataan, because ultimately, he's writing this with some distance. He'd written about, at length, the assassination of Dr. King and Malcolm X in No Name in the Street from 1971, and also an abridged version of that book appeared in Esquire magazine as Malcolm and Martin, and he's writing this certainly just a few years removed, just 2 years removed after Dr. King's assassination. But here, Remember This House, he's writing it a decade later, right? After the formal end of the kind of civil rights movement, with a different kind of hindsight, with a different kind of recollective eye, if you will, right? So I take that idea of re/member. Ultimately, this is a manuscript and a film remembering the brutal killing of 3 of his friends, right? So I think it's a play on words, to remember, meaning to put together bodies that have been severed, that has been dismembered. Precisely, that's what their assassination was, right? Even though they weren't literally disfigured, dismembered, they were killed, they were assassinated, right? So in a way, it's maybe to remember as a kind of mourning ritual, to put back their bodies that was so brutally taken, brutally shot, brutally assassinated. And the other, I would say, is, the act of memory and the act of nation building are deeply intertwined. You cannot separate the two, right? Nations thrive on a kind of collective mythology, right? A collective memory of the beginnings, the kind of incipient stages of any given nation. Some of it is fiction, some of it is real, right? And I think Baldwin writing Remember This House in 1979 and looking back at his own life, the assassination of his friends, I think he's trying to say, how can we rebuild this house? How can we put together this house that remains so divided along racial lines, right? And you cannot build that house, you cannot reassemble that house based on lies, based on innocence, based on nostalgia of an American past. And Baldwin was so adamant that in order for America to achieve itself, achieve its promise, it had to contend with its mythology, right? And that mythology is not some, pilgrims came, fleeing persecution and, erected this grand edifice. No, that the country is built on dispossession, on extermination of Native populations. It's built on the blood and toil and labor and life of Black people, right? So he's trying, I think, to say, in order to rebuild this house, we also have to reconstitute the myths and narratives of American society. And it also reminds me of, again, to go back to Toni Morrison, Morrison has this idea of rememory in her classic novel, Beloved, from 1986, where this is the character Setha, when, she says, places are there, she says like something like a house may burn down, it's gone, but the picture of it stays, right? So in spite of an American, the government, civic institutions, including cultural institutions like Hollywood, that are bent on erasing the past, the place is there, right? The legacy of the kind of violent acts that are also part of the founding of the American experiment are still there. So I think he's playing on with this notion of remembering in its different iterations.
I'd like to move on to the film, the structure of the film and the filmmaker. And I'd like to start off by just giving a short background on the director, Raoul Peck, in the hope that it would allow others to understand and contextualize why he would have possibly chosen to make this film. So Raoul Peck was born in Port-au-Prince, Haiti in 1953. In 1961, his father moved to the newly independent state of Congo after the dictator Francois Duvalier came into power in Haiti. The Congo was going through its own set of problems, being a newly independent state, and after the assassination of the first freely elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, who helped gain Congo's independence. And after his death, the country went through a period of political upheaval. Raoul and his mother moved and followed his father in 1962. I think we can both agree that at such a young age, these are a substantial set of events to go through and are very formative in anyone's life. Moving forward, Raoul moved to the US, followed by France, and graduated college in Berlin. And in many of his interviews, he expresses the lack of literature and film that would allow him to understand his condition as a Black man living in this world, whether it was in predominantly Black societies in Africa or in the West, predominantly white societies. But to start off with the film, I'd like to ask you the cliche, very cliche question of where did you first see the film? And how did it make you feel when you stepped out of the theater or at home?
Great question, Sataan. Well, so when I first saw the film on my little computer screen, because I was sent an advance link to the film before it debuted in the theaters, because I was reviewing it for publication, all right? And then just a week later, I went down to New York City and I saw it at the Magic Johnson Theater on 125th Street and Frederick Douglass in Harlem. And that was an exhilarating experience. And I still can remember the kind of, if you go to see a film with predominantly Black audience, so this film theater, I saw it in Harlem, is the call and response. So audiences speak to the screen, right? In a real visceral way. And I remember just countless instances where you would hear the audience, including myself, expressions of awe, affirmation, yes, preach, Baldwin, right? Of rage, especially in moments where all of a sudden we have the collapsing of Baldwin speaking about the 1960s, and then when Peck cuts to the protest in Ferguson, right? You feel the rage. And I remember as soon as the film ended, I turned to the guy who was sitting right next to me, gave him a big hug. A woman sitting next to me, I gave her a big hug. So there was a sense of communion we felt, a shared sense of longing, sense of rage, but also just delight to be in the presence of such an extraordinary thinker that Raoul Peck has made available for our time. So yeah, that was my reaction, and I'm glad I saw it in Harlem.
That's great. So the film, I'm sure that these are a lot of the moments where in the theater, people probably spoke to the screen and spoke to each other. But the film really juxtaposes images and scenes from the past and present. You have the Birmingham riots of 1963, after bombings targeting Martin Luther King, and then the riots in Ferguson in 2014 after the killing of Michael Brown. Nothing really seems to have changed in America, and the director felt the need to speak to America through, a strong voice such as James Baldwin. How do you see the resemblance between what Baldwin was saying in the 1950s and 60s and today's America? As I know you're speaking right now from Sharjah, but as someone that spent a lot of his life living in the U.S., how has your experience been, and how do you see this resemblance?
Well, Sataan, as you rightly put it, I mean, part of what's so evocative about the film is precisely how that kind of overlay of Baldwin's words to speak to our own moment. And in many ways, James Baldwin has become the public intellectual of our own time. And he is, and there's scholars who've actually taken like a tally of this, the most cited, living or dead, artist to talk about what's been happening, all these killings of Black men and women and children, right? And on protests too. In fact, right before I came to Philadelphia, right after the killing of George Floyd, a protest that I attended in Philadelphia, I saw different signs of Baldwin quotes, including one that said, ignorance allied with power is the most ferocious enemy justice can have, right? So you would think Baldwin is actually writing today. Now, the thing about progress is this: to say that no progress has been made would be a lie, right? Because even in Baldwin's own lifetime, as I said, he started writing his first set of essays in the late 1940s and saw the end of de jure segregation, right? Prior to the kind of passage of the omnibus civil rights bills in 1964, 1965, African Americans, by law, were deemed to be second-class citizens, disenfranchised, could not exercise that fundamental right to vote, right? So to say that's not that change in the law, of which, Baldwin lent his talent to upend American apartheid, that's progress. The very fact that, he is the kind of lionized literary figure, and we can finally appreciate his full talent, right? Not just for what he teaches us about American racism, but also an artist with exceptional talent in terms of the craft of the novel, right? That we can take him seriously as a writer and not dismiss him as a Negro writer. That also, I think, is progress. But we cannot exaggerate the progress that American civilization is still a racist civilization. White lawlessness is the law, as we have seen, from the White House to the Justice Department to many a police precinct, right? white lawlessness is the law. And this is the thing, and we've seen this, I mean, with the current politics in American life today, right? That race is still the most animating force in American public life, right? And white people continue to cling to this absurd notion of whiteness and white supremacy and some fabricated notion of superiority and some wild notion of Black life that they have invented in order to make themselves feel better. I mean, ultimately, right? And that has a way of coloring everything from how our law is organized to just mediating everyday encounters, right? So in that sense, the ruin, and this is something that many observers, even from outside, Alexis de Tocqueville's, 2-volume work on American democracy from the 19th century, he says, the thing that will undermine American civilization is not, external forces from outside, but it is internal forces, and it is the question of race. And until America deals with the question of race, it will be the thing that will undo this democratic experiment, as we're seeing at this very hour, right? Who is in power and what enabled him to come to power? How is he clinging to power? It is by exploiting race. If you were to take that equation out of the picture today, we wouldn't have the kind of, catastrophic scene that we're seeing on the American public stage today, right? So yes, progress has been made, but nearly not enough.
Yeah, there's a huge disconnect between political America and the public. Policy and government has not really changed. It is still predominantly white, and we see that public life in general has changed, but the policy is what determines the shifts in power, the power. That's who holds the power.
Absolutely. And the cultural norms have to change, right? This is the thing that Baldwin used to say, our vocabulary has to change. And this is what I said at the outset, that his fierce determination to undo the racist and racial assumptions of not just American civilization, but also the English language itself, right? One way that white colonial power, white rule has enforced itself, right, is by manipulation of the very language, right? And I think the burden of many a Black artist, be or she African-American, Nigerian, or, Sudanese, Ethiopian, Afro-British, Caribbean, has been undoing all these trappings of the language, which is meant to continue to subjugate us, right? And so our mores have to change. Our moral attitude has to change. And Baldwin was accustomed to saying, whiteness is a moral choice, which I love. Whiteness is a moral choice, which is to say that white people don't have to subscribe to an identity that is so tethered to supremacist power.
Whiteness as an analogy for power.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I'd just like to remind our audience, for any questions, they could please, if you could please use the Q&A feature in Zoom. Dagmawi, I'd like to bring up a point, which is the anger that exists within all of this content and this film. I mean, anger is usually an alienating and exclusionary. It is an alienating and exclusionary at times. But while watching this film and attempting to put myself in the shoes of anyone, whether it was Baldwin, the director, or any of the people that lived through these difficult times, you can't help but feel that it is justified. I also think of how frustrating it must have been to go through all of this content while making the film. It must be enraging and very angry. But my point is that for Raoul Peck to make such a film focusing on such a strong individual like James Baldwin, and including all this material and music, and very particularly the ending of the film with Baldwin's statement in his interview, which is from the price of the ticket, the price of this ticket, and then ending the film with a song from Kendrick Lamar from the album, the song called "The Blacker the Berry," gave me a sense that all these people share a collected and very composed anger. Would you say that this is the atmosphere that existed when you left the theater in Harlem and America at that time in 2017?
No doubt about it, because I mean, well, this is the thing I'd say about Black anger or Black rage, right? It has many manifestations. On the one hand, it is precisely because Black people have harnessed that anger and that rage that they have transformed American civilization. You would not have the civil rights movement, the Black Power movement, right, without Black anger. You can harness it so that it is productive, so that it can transform, a racist system. But it's also a double-edged sword. Anger could also lead to, you could implode, right? Black rage and Black anger could give you, as it does to many Black people in America, hypertension, right? I mean, just to relate to what's happening, who's dying disproportionately of COVID-19 in the United States? It's African Americans. Why? Because African Americans have pre-existing health conditions. Why? Because of clinicians and social scientists have done the way in which all the kind of, not just explicit racism, but what we call microaggressions, the way they take a toll on our health, hypertension, high blood pressure, so on and so forth, right? So that rage, unless it finds a productive outlet, can kill you, can lead to premature death, right? But at the same time, it is that anger that has given us Black Lives Matter, right? One of the most important global movements today, not just in terms of how it's transformed contemporary American life, but we see disempowered people all over the globe taking the mantra of Black Lives Matter in Brazil, in Algeria, you name the place, right? To express the collective will of the disesteemed, right? So anger, all this to say, Sataan, in a long-winded way, is yes, the anger is there, and there's no way as a Black person in America that you have not expressed that kind of rage and anger just by virtue of being Black in a deeply racist society.
No, that's true. And it also it really makes you ask the question of, would Martin Luther King's approach to the civil rights movement, would it have been accepted had it not been for Malcolm X's more violent approach to the civil rights movement?
Well, so this is the thing, Dr. King, one is, and Baldwin says this, in fact, in I'm Not Your Negro, in the manuscript for Remember This House, is that by the end of their lives, there was a nominal difference between the two. Now, it is true, Dr. King had a different philosophy that helped to undergird his nonviolent, it was called, if you recall, nonviolent militant action. And it was this notion of agape love. He was a Christian minister, right? And his notion was love as embodied in Christ, right? He took that theology of agape love from the Christian doctrine and used it for political purposes. Malcolm is coming from a different perspective. as a Muslim, as initially part of the Nation of Islam, and also with a different kind of irreverence. But this is the thing also with American life. We have sanitized Dr. King's image. So, every February, Black History Month, McDonald's commercial would cite from I Have a Dream, right?
Yeah.
But not cite Dr. King, who, when he died in 1968, the public he was no longer favorable among the public, and also was no longer favorable by the Black political class, including the NAACP. And people don't quote Dr. King, who said, shortly before he died, he said, "I fear that my country has become the greatest purveyor of violence in the world today." That's not Malcolm X, that's Dr. King. Right? So we also have to, and this is, thank you, Sataan, this is exactly what I think Baldwin was trying to do with Remember This House, kind of correct the kind of iconography, the public iconography of these two figures, and indeed the three figures, and show by the end of their, kind of abbreviated lives, how they actually shared a common approach, a common philosophy.
I'd like to move on to the next point before opening it up for questions. We have a few questions coming in. But you wrote a review on this film for The Atlantic titled The Imperfect Power of I Am Not Your Negro. For such a highly rated film, the title of your review might seem a bit controversial to some people. I'm sure that most, if not all, attendees today have read your review, but of course, we're lucky to have you with us. And hearing you speaking about it in the flesh or virtually would be obviously much nicer. Could you share some thoughts you mentioned in the review and why you think there's some imperfections in the film?
Sure thing. I mean, first and foremost, it is a brilliant film. And I think the kind of, and just beautifully edited. And I think Raoul Peck has done us all a great service by introducing Baldwin to a new generation of filmgoers, a new audience, and also connecting how Baldwin's words matter today, right? So I don't want to take anything away from the kind of merits of the film, but I do have, my critique is, it's twofold. On the one hand, when Baldwin is, writing the notes towards Remember This House in 1979, that's a different Baldwin than Baldwin of the civil rights movement. So the Baldwin we encounter in the film is Baldwin, the kind of race man, the public intellectual who is called on the, on these shows, on the public stage, to talk about American racial matters in the 1960s, right? But the Baldwin of Remember This House, the Baldwin who is penning, who is sketching Remember This House in 1979, is a different author. In 1979, Baldwin had just completed his magnum opus, his longest and most ambitious novel, Just Above My Head. That novel, the protagonist, Arthur Montana, is a world-renowned gospel singer who is, travels the world, and it's a coming-of-age story, but also a gay character, right? And if you look at Baldwin's overall corpus, but certainly his late essays, is, again, what I said at the outset, the complexity of identity, Baldwin's own identity, right? To broach matters of queer sexuality, right? In relation to other nodes of identity, like nationality, like race, like class. And watching the film, that element, that abiding thread, abiding principle in Baldwin's of is erased in the film. There's only really one passing reference, and it cited what the kind of tabs the FBI kept on Baldwin as an alleged homosexual, and then a passing reference, another passing reference. So I thought in my review of the film that the film could also touch on the Baldwin of 1979 and given us this complexity, right, of how identity is such a fraught and complex affair. And I thought the film kind of reified this notion of Baldwin, the race man, and Baldwin, the civil rights era figure. So that was my critique in a nutshell.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dagmawi. So we've reached the hour, but we have a few questions, and I think we should obviously take them. We have a question from Selam Sertsu, and the question is the Black experience a necessary cultural habit that needs to be explored in order for the existence of the American experience?
Great question, right? So this is the thing that, I mean, Baldwin, you know, the notion of being a transatlantic commuter is that you see how Blackness, the very idea of Blackness, shifts from place to place. So what it means to be, you know, of Senegalese descent or of Haitian descent living in Paris in the 50s or even today is different than what it means to be an African American in the US, or what it means to be an African American of who counts as descendants to many generations, or someone like me who's a recent transplant, right? So, or what it means to be Black in Ethiopia is quite different from what it means to be Black in South Africa, right? So what we see in Baldwin in the main is, even as he's questioning and challenging and critiquing white supremacy, he's also giving us the extraordinary life, the beauty, the complexity of African-American culture. So for instance, song, right? In Baldwin, there's always is just his own fascination and fidelity to song. In fact, you know, when he was completing his first novel, Go Tell It on the Mountain, this is when he's having left for France, he says, what gave me the key to complete this novel was listening to records of the blues, right? And his last novel, Just Above My Head, he says, God, I was trying to sound like Aretha Franklin, but I think I have failed, right? And when you think about African-American culture and its contributions to world culture, contemporary music as we know it would not exist without African-American music, period, right? Without jazz, without soul music, without R&B music, without hip hop, right? We would not have world music today, right? So all this to say, you know, so Black identity on the one hand, it's cultural, it's political, it's social, right? It's regional, it has all these different manifestations that I think Baldwin's essays and fiction attend to with complexity.
We have another question from Nawar Ghali, and I think it is important to speak about Baldwin and his time in Cambridge, particularly probably the interview or the debate between James Baldwin and William Buckley.
Yes.
If you could tell us, was he invited to the debate and why he felt the need to go, and some of the topics that he addressed?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, it was a debate between two, you know, William Buckley was a kind of major conservative public intellectual, and Baldwin, a major artist and public intellectual, and they were both invited by the Oxford Union, I believe, Students' Union, who stages a long history of staging these debates. And I mean, not because I'm biased towards Baldwin, but I would just encourage you to watch that debate.
Absolutely.
And the way in which Baldwin just at each turn totally undermines whatever arguments that Buckley is advancing, right? And you can see this also with other public appearances. On the Dick Cavett show, for instance, there's a professor from Yale who tries to come up with some kind of easy, facile notion of the racial dilemma, that it's only personal. If individuals change, well, no, it's also structural. It's also systematic, right? And Baldwin says something like, he says, I don't know whether, individuals are racist. He says, I can't get into I'm not a psychotherapist. I can't get into somebody's head. But what I do know is the labor unions don't employ me, right? The churches are segregated, right? I can't get adequate education. The prisons are full of people who look like me, right? So we have to, it's not just simply about individual feelings, it's also systematic and structural. And in these debates, I think Baldwin shines because he's an artist, right? So he just has a way, such mastery of the language that he's able to speak to your heart and also to your intellect. And that's the case with the Buckley debate at Oxford. Now, Baldwin went, because he was such a sought after literary artist and public intellectual, went to the UK on numerous occasions. And the film, one of the films I mentioned, Horace Ove's film from 1968, there he's speaking in London, and he'd been invited by a Caribbean student association, I believe. And that's also a great film to watch. I believe it's available online.
We have another question from Elizabeth Georges. She asks, in the film, Raoul shows us Bobby Kennedy and Kennedy's statement that the treatment of Negroes has really improved and that he will not be surprised if a Black president would be elected in 40 years. And sure enough, Obama comes 40-something years later, and the film shows us that the inauguration of Obama. Can we reflect on that? The film is using the inauguration as a metaphor, maybe, and why and what happened in the post-Obama era in a Baldwinian mode of thought?
Thank you, LCA, for such a complex question. I don't know if I could do full justice to it, but I'll say this. Symbols matter, right? So the fact that a Black person and a Black family was able to occupy the White House is significant. There's no doubt about that, right? As I said, symbols matter. Just that image, right, of a Black president, a Black family in that White House, especially Michelle Obama being unapologetically Black as she wanted to be. Those symbols matter, right? They, reverberate, certainly for Black people in a deep way. That said, right, I think had Baldwin been alive, he would have been one of the first people to mount serious critique of the Obama administration, right? Because ultimately, Baldwin is very suspicious of power, however that power manifests itself, right? And mind you, he was also, during the course of his lifetime, very critical of Black people clothed with power. So if you think of his kind of iconic piece of the Civil Rights Movement, The Fire Next Time from 1963, in that book, who is he critical of? Elijah Muhammad, the leader of the Nation of Islam, clothed with so much power. The NAACP, often he says, of their bourgeois kind of respectability, very critical of that. And I think with Obama, he would have been critical of Obama by virtue of the fact that he is commander-in-chief of an empire and an imperial force. There's no way that Baldwin would have been silent when drones were being dropped and killing innocent people in Africa, in the Middle East, right? There's no way. Baldwin would have been critical of the number of people who were deported during the Obama administration, right? The deporter in chief, that is true, that was Obama. We have to, that's his record, right? And also Baldwin would have been critical of the very fact, what kind of progress did we make under the Obama administration, right? In terms of empowering Black people. So yes, symbolism matters, but the very fact that you have a Black man who is presiding over the greatest imperial force would have made him fair game for James Baldwin to level serious and trenchant critique.
We have a last, I think this could be the last question that we take, which is by Guy Weyete. And he asks, is there any way we can speak about African or Black experience in the contemporary world without referring to the African-American history?
Can I just say something, Sataan, if I may, because it's a question. It was actually, I intended to ask a question.
Yes,
Can you hear me? Sorry. I intended to ask Dagmawi a question about kind of one of the least known essays by, perhaps in your world, I'm sure it's very well known, Dagmawi, but in general, it's in Encounter magazine, which is used to be part of the US Information Agency funded magazines in Europe. He wrote a report on the 1956 Congress of Black writers and artists. And in it, I mean, what I'm interested in is this encounter that he has with one of the continental Africans in the conference itself, who said to him, but you are really not an African. He's referencing African-American who are light-skinned. And the answer by James, which is, it's the most probably articulate, deep reflections on the relationship between African and African Americans. And it actually, that pattern continued, okay? And I raised this in the context of the guy, Wati, I don't know, I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, that the film director, there was a question before that. Can we speak about African or Black experience in the contemporary without referring to the African-American history? And I say this because James reflected on the differences, but also commonalities.
Yes.
But what I wanted to focus on, I'm tempted to answer the question of Guy, and I want you just to comment on this. I'm just gonna make it like a little bit of an extended comment, is that the question of Guy here seems to be almost like the typical question that we hear now. For me, for example, when I came as a student in the 1980s in the United States for the graduate level, and I hear it now from recent African immigrants to the US, is that there is always a viewing of the African American with suspicion that these people are different, they're not like Africans, why they don't take care, like advantage of the education and loans, without understanding, of course, how oppression, poverty, kind of perpetuate and so forth within certain communities, and which defy the American myth of, what is it called? Bring yourself up with the boot, whatever, straps and something like that. These kind of expressions of the American dream. But I wanted to say directly to this, just few things. First of all, we can no longer talk about an African experience that is continental without thinking of a global African presence by the very fact of decolonization, but also slavery prior to that. And that if you think about an African experience or world or view, it's impossible at the intellectual level to make that separation, because the impact of Pan-Africanism and by extension, the impact of diaspora African, if you notice, like Pan-Africanism is either a product of an African who were back and forth between the United States or the Caribbean and other places of the diaspora, such as Padmore, such as, if I even within that kind of a school of thought. They shaped the experience of many revolutionary or intellectual thoughts. Negritude can never be thought of as just a continental African because of M.S. Azer and others who were also involved in that. It actually, it was in Paris where the nucleus of this kind of movement kind of developed. And then finally, I thought if you think about music, there is always what Paul Gilroy said, that you can never think about the African or the Black intellectual experience without thinking about this circle of Africa, Europe, the continent, and the US, meaning what he called it as a sailing motif, like back and forth. Many music experiences now, for example, if I think about Afrobeat, can you separate it from hip hop or American music? If you think about South African music, can you not think about African American jazz and influence? Can you think about blues, or you think about people, major Malayan singers who sing this kind of bluesy style without listening to American blues? And there's always a debate who made it first and who, is it African, is it African American? So I'm trying to say is that it's impossible to separate both, but it's also, yes, in terms of some particularities, if you're talking about certain experience, yes, you can think about an African experience without an African American, but overall, if we're thinking at the intellectual level, it's impossible. But anyway, I thought about responding to that, but you can respond to it, and I just wanted your comment on the earlier, that eloquent experience response to the African man who asked him, to the continental African man who asked him.
Yes. Well, thank you, Salah. I mean, I'm just going to underline, you said it eloquently, so I'll just underline the point you made, which is to say that we cannot succumb to these narrow definitions of Africanness or Blackness. The Black experience is one of the most expansive experiences that we have, right? To be Black is to be cosmopolitan. Like, we are the true cosmopolitans when you think about it, right? I mean, and by we, I mean, when you think about experiences of the Caribbean, across the centuries, who were some of the most cosmopolitan figures of, say, I don't know, the 18th century? Equiano who was a slave, who was captured from West Africa, and then goes to London, right? In his narrative, we see glimpses of what happens about his experience in Liverpool, what happens in the US, right? Of that, if with the making of the modern world, the true cosmopolitans include those who were chained and placed in the hulls of ships and unwillingly transported to the New World. Now, internationalism and cosmopolitanism quite often focus on the elite, the erudite, the wealthy, those who have access to cultural institutions and power, right? But if we look at a kind of global perspective from below, right, we can create this history of a truly global world from its inception, right, centuries ago, to this date. And some of the, not all Black, but some of the exemplary figures are Black people, right? That's one. The other thing too is, the Baldwin's own, Salah, to the quote that you brought up, Baldwin's own perspective on Africa changes over time, right? It's one thing when he is, for instance, in Paris as a young writer, documenting the Congress of Black Writers, writing about the Congress of Black Writers, when, this is prior to 1960. So the continent is still under the yoke of European colonialism. That's a different relationship of African-American, as an African-American man, encountering other Africans in Paris, in the metropole, who are still under the yokes of European colonialism. Baldwin's own relationship to the continent changes over time, right? And you see this in his work. So, for instance, in his last novel, Just Above My Head, the character I mentioned, Julia, who goes to Africa, and her perspective of Africa is very different than even the ones Baldwin was putting forward in the 50s, right? And later on, Baldwin's own collaboration, for instance, with Chinua Achebe, there's a famous dialogue between the two, right? Wole Soyinka, for instance, has written on Baldwin's unpublished play that I cited, The Welcome Table. And Baldwin was one of the contributors to Perspectives on African Art, which is a show of African masks that different curators and artists were to reflect on. And in the late work, Baldwin draws a different kind of kinship between himself as an African-American and Africans in ways that he was even hesitant to do maybe in the 1950s, right? So all this to say, we cannot collapse the differences because differences assert themselves based on what language you speak, what your ethnicity may be, what your religion, what your national identity may be. But there is a Pan-African identity that also transcends these other divisions and distinctions.
Salah, would you like to, do you have any other comments or any questions that you'd like to ask?
I know, I think there are just other questions that may be worth thinking about in the, because there is this Nawar Goli was asking a question. Where do we find this dialogue between Baldwin and Achebe? That's important.
Yes, so this was a conversation that took place in 1980 in University of Florida, Gainesville. But later on, if you look at Pen America, it's this is the organization for writers in the States. Pen America published a small volume around Baldwin. And you can also find Chinua Achebe's essay on James Baldwin in that volume, Pen America, and do Pen America, Chinua Achebe, and so forth. But their dialogue is also captured in the film, one of the films I mentioned, I Heard It Through the Grapevine. Now, it used to be available online, it's been taken down, but if you can find that maybe through your university or I Heard It Through Grapevine, there's a great segment with Achebe. And what I love about that segment is, so they meet in Florida and they do a tour of St. Augustine in Florida. Now, St. Augustine used to be one of the most profitable slave markets in the United States. And here's James Baldwin with Chinua Achebe, and he's giving him a tour. And he says, you know, Chinua, this is where we met. This is where our relationship begins. And you get these really suggestive conversations about that relationship, the beginnings of that relationships between these two esteemed authors. Yeah, so those two, I Heard It Through the Grapevine, and then in Pen America, you'll find these connections.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I think we've run out of time for today. But Dagmawi, I cannot really thank you enough for having this conversation, for sharing all this information on James Baldwin and just generally your experience with James Baldwin throughout the years. I'd like to remind everyone that the film is still available for live streaming on our website until midnight tonight. And we have another upcoming program from the 6th until the 9th of December. We will feature two films, America Street and Indochina by the Professor Idrisu Morakpai of Ithaca College. So please stay tuned on our social media channels and our website. Yes, Dagmawi.
Sataan, I just wanted to say this has been lovely. Thank you so much for asking me to do this, and more importantly, to join you in this conversation. It's been delightful. And can I say my favorite James Baldwin quote? It might be a nice way of summing up.
Absolutely, please do.
Which is about, I mentioned, love is the kind of binding principle in Baldwin's work. And one of my favorite quotes comes from The Fire Next Time, where Baldwin says, "Love takes off the masks we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within." Thank you.
Nice. Thank you very much.